The notice wasn't subtle. It was bright orange, impossible to ignore, pressed flat against the windshield of a black truck that hadn't moved overnight. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have called the number at the bottom, or rushed to move their vehicle before things got worse. But Daniel Reeves didn't even look surprised, because this wasn't the first notice. And it wasn't really about the truck. Across the street, behind perfectly trimmed hedges, Karen Whitmore was watching, waiting, certain that this time she had finally pushed far enough. What she didn't know was that the call she had already made that morning was about to come back to her, in the worst possible way.
I can't believe this. This changes everything.
What am I gonna do?
They know we have to go.
What? How?
No time. We leave now.
Where to?
Yeah, I understand.
What's going on?
They said we need to leave now.
Let's go.
Oh no. I have to go.
Where have you been?
I was just out.
You can't just disappear.
I had to.
The neighborhood looked perfect from a distance. Every lawn trimmed to the same height, every mailbox polished, every driveway carefully maintained. It was the kind of place where nothing seemed out of line. But perfection like that doesn't happen naturally. It's enforced. And in this neighborhood, enforcement had a name. Karen Whitmore. She wasn't just part of the HOA. She was the HOA. Not officially, of course. There were other board members. But none of them spoke as loudly. None of them pushed as hard. And none of them enjoyed control the way she did. At first, people thought she was helpful, organized, dedicated. But over time, that perception changed. Because Karen didn't just care about rules. She cared about who followed them and who didn't. Daniel Reeves moved in quietly.
No announcement.
No attempt to meet neighbors. Just a moving truck one afternoon. And by evening, he was already settled. He didn't cause problems. Didn't host loud gatherings. Didn't leave trash out. In fact, if you asked most people on the street, they'd struggle to say anything about him at all. Except one thing. The truck. It was older but not neglected. Black paint. Clean lines. A vehicle that looked like it worked for a living. And that alone was enough. The first notice appeared on a Tuesday morning. Bright orange. Bold lettering. Unauthorized vehicle, HOA violation. Daniel read it once, then folded it neatly, and placed it inside his house. No reaction.
No complaint.
No phone call, which, in Karen's world, was unacceptable. By Thursday, a second notice appeared. This one more aggressive. Fines listed. Deadlines included. Language sharper. Still nothing. Daniel continued his routine exactly the same. Morning coffee. Short drive. Return before sunset. No visible stress. No sign of frustration. And that started to bother her. Karen wasn't used to being ignored. Most people responded immediately. Apologies. Explanations. Compliance. But Daniel? He acted like the notices didn't matter. So she escalated. The emails began. Long, detailed. Formal. Filled with references to HOA bylaws. Subsections. Clauses. Penalties. She CC'd other board members. Made it official. Made it visible. Still no response. At the next HOA meeting, she brought it up publicly. Not aggressively at first. Just enough to draw attention. There are ongoing violations that we need to address. Eyes shifted.
People knew who she meant.
Daniel wasn't there. He never attended meetings, which made it easier. But something unexpected happened. A neighbor spoke up. Quietly. He doesn't seem to bother anyone. Karen smiled. Polite. Controlled. That's not the point. Rules exist for a reason. And just like that, the room fell silent again. Because everyone knew, arguing with Karen didn't end well. Over the next week, the pressure increased. Daily notices.
Stacking fines.
Printed warnings taped to the door. And still, Daniel didn't react. Not outwardly. But behind that silence, he was paying attention. Every notice. Every timestamp. Every clause she cited. He kept everything. Organized.
Documented.
Patient. Across the street, Karen watched more often now. Through blinds that barely moved. Tracking patterns. trying to understand him. But what frustrated her most was how predictable he seemed, and how completely he refused to engage. To her, it looked like stubbornness, like defiance, like someone who thought he could outlast the system. And that made it personal. So one morning, she made a decision. Not emotional, not impulsive, calculated. She picked up her phone and called enforcement. Her tone was calm, professional, confident. Yes, I'd like to initiate a vehicle removal under HOA authority. She gave the address, described the truck, cited the violations, everything by the book, at least from her perspective. Then she hung up and walked to the window, the same window she'd been watching from all week. The truck was still there, unmoved, unbothered. She allowed herself a small smile, because in her mind, this was the moment things shifted. He had ignored the warnings, avoided the consequences, refused to participate.
But now?
Now it was out of his hands. And across the street, inside a quiet house, Daniel sat at his table, looking at his phone. A single message had just come through.
Short.
Simple. And very clear. They just called us. The call had already been made. And in Karen Whitmore's world, that meant the outcome was inevitable. Once something moved beyond notices, beyond emails, beyond meetings, it became enforcement. And enforcement didn't ask for permission. The next morning felt different. Not visibly. The same trimmed lawns. The same quiet street. The same black truck, parked exactly where it had always been. But underneath that stillness, something had shifted. Because now there was a process in motion. Karen moved through her morning routine with unusual precision. Coffee brewed exactly the same way. Curtains opened at the same angle. But her attention kept drifting back to the window, back to the truck, back to the house across the street. She expected movement. Panic, maybe. A rushed attempt to fix things. But Daniel Reeves stepped out of his house the same way he always did.
Calm.
Unhurried. Holding his keys like nothing had changed. He glanced at the truck. Just once. Not inspecting it. Not worried. Just acknowledging it. Then he got in and drove away. Karen frowned slightly. Not anger. Not yet. Just confusion. Because by now he should have known. Inside his house, the notices were still there. Stacked neatly on a small table. Not crumpled. Not ignored. Documented. Every single one. Daniel had read them all. More than once. Not for the warnings, but for the details. The wording. The structure. The authority behind them. He wasn't reacting, because he was studying. Across town, in a small office that didn't look particularly important, a phone rang. A dispatcher picked it up. Listened carefully. Typed slowly. HOA authorization, vehicle removal request, residential violation. It wasn't unusual. These kinds of calls came in often. Most of them routine. Most of them straightforward. But this one had something slightly different. Not obvious. Not enough to raise alarms. Just enough to pause. The dispatcher read the vehicle description again. Black truck. Older model. Well-maintained. No commercial markings listed. They hesitated. Then forwarded the request. Standard procedure. Meanwhile, Karen had already moved to the next phase. The HOA board meeting was scheduled that evening. Attendance was higher than usual. Word had spread. Not loudly. Not publicly. But quietly from neighbor to neighbor. Something was happening. And people were curious. Karen sat at the front.
Composed.
Prepared. A folder in front of her filled with printed documents. Not because she needed them, but because it looked official. When the meeting began, she didn't mention Daniel immediately. She waited. Worked through smaller topics first. Landscaping updates. Parking reminders. General compliance. Then she shifted. Subtle, but intentional. There is an ongoing issue that requires formal action. The room quieted. People already knew. They just didn't say it. She outlined the situation. Carefully. Controlled. Framing it not as personal, but procedural. A vehicle has remained in violation despite repeated notices. She didn't say his name at first. But she didn't need to. A few people exchanged glances. One neighbor leaned slightly forward. "It's just a truck," someone said quietly. Karen didn't react emotionally, but her tone sharpened just slightly. "It's not about the truck. It's about compliance." And there it was, the word she valued most. Compliance. Another voice spoke up, more hesitant. "Has he responded at all?" Karen paused. Just long enough.
No.
Technically true, but not complete, because silence can be a response. And Daniel's silence was very intentional. The room settled again, because, without opposition, Karen's position became stronger. She concluded with a decision. Enforcement action has been initiated. No drama. No raised voice. Just a statement. And with that, it became official. Outside, the street remained unchanged. But now, the timeline had started. Later that night, Karen stood by her window again. Lights off. Watching. Daniel's house was quiet. No signs of concern. No movement that suggested urgency. And that unsettled her more than anything else. Because, in her experience, people always reacted by now. They called. They argued. They negotiated. They tried to fix things. But Daniel?
He did none of that.
Instead, he sat inside his house, at the same table, looking at a different set of information. Not HOA rules. Not violation notices. But something else entirely. A system dashboard.
Clean.
Organized. Professional. A list of incoming requests. Service calls. Locations. Authorizations. And, among them, one request stood out. The address was familiar. Very familiar.
He didn't rush.
Didn't react immediately. He simply read through it. Every detail. Every note. Every authorization line. Then leaned back slightly. Not surprised. Not amused. Just certain. He picked up his phone. Typed a short message. Hold assignment. Confirm source. Across town, the dispatcher received it.
Paused.
Read it again. Then looked back at the request. Something clicked. They checked the account attached to the call, the authorization trail, the requesting entity, and then they made a second call. This one quieter, more careful. Back in the neighborhood, Karen finally stepped away from the window, confident, certain everything was moving exactly as planned. Because from her perspective,
it was.
What she didn't see was how many moving parts had already shifted, and how many of them were no longer under her control. The next morning arrived slowly. Sunlight across the street. Soft shadows. Stillness. Then, in the distance, a truck turned the corner. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just present. It moved down the street at a controlled pace. Professional. Measured. Karen saw it immediately. And for the first time, since this started, she smiled. Because this was the moment she had been waiting for. Across the street, Daniel stepped outside. Same calm expression. Same unhurried movement. But this time, he didn't reach for his truck. He simply stood there, watching, as the repo vehicle rolled closer.
Lam, in be in.
Until it stopped, right in front of his house. The engine idled. The driver didn't step out immediately. Instead, he looked at the truck, then at the house, then back at the truck again. Something wasn't lining up. He reached for his phone, made a call.
Quiet.
Brief. Across the street, Karen's smile began to fade, just slightly. Because this wasn't how it usually went. There was no immediate action.
No urgency.
No movement to hook the vehicle. Just hesitation. And Daniel? He didn't say a word. He just stood there, calm still, watching everything unfold exactly the way he expected. The driver stepped out, closed the door slowly, looked directly at Daniel. There was recognition in his eyes. Not confusion. Not authority. Recognition. And in that moment, the entire situation shifted. Because this was no longer a routine job. And whatever Karen had set in motion was about to turn into something very different. The driver spoke quietly into his phone one more time, then nodded, and looked back at Daniel. Across the street, Karen took a step forward. Something wasn't right. Not yet clear. Not yet visible. but unmistakable. For the first time since this began, she wasn't in control of what happened next. And she didn't even realize it yet. The driver didn't raise his voice, didn't act uncertain, but there was a noticeable change in his posture. Less authority, more caution. Sir, we need to confirm something before we proceed. Daniel didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked like he had been waiting for that exact sentence. He took a step closer. Not aggressive, not defensive, just present. What do you need to confirm? The driver glanced briefly at the truck again, then back at Daniel. This vehicle, it's listed under a company-linked record. A pause. Short, but heavy. Daniel nodded slightly. That's correct. Across the street, Karen leaned forward. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the hesitation. And hesitation wasn't part of the plan. The driver continued carefully, and the company attached to it. He hesitated again. We're affiliated with it. That was the moment everything changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Daniel reached into his pocket,
Pulled out his phone.
opened something, turned the screen slightly. Not to prove, not to argue, just to confirm. The driver looked at it and immediately straightened. Respect replaced uncertainty. Understood. No more questions. No more hesitation. Because now, the situation wasn't ambiguous anymore. Across the street, Karen stepped outside. She couldn't stay behind the window anymore. This wasn't how enforcement worked. There were steps, a process, a visible result. And right now, nothing was happening. She walked across the street, controlled but faster than usual. Is there a problem? She asked. The driver turned toward her. Professional. Neutral. We're verifying authorization. Karen's tone sharpened. It's already authorized. I made the request myself. The driver didn't argue, didn't react. He simply responded, Yes, ma'am. And we're confirming the ownership details. Ownership. That word landed heavier than she expected. She looked at Daniel, for the first time not with authority, but with uncertainty. Ownership of what? She asked. Daniel finally spoke directly to her.
Calm.
Even. You might want to check who you hired. Silence. The driver's phone rang. He answered immediately, listened, nodded once. Understood. Then he ended the call and turned fully toward Karen. Ma'am, we won't be proceeding with the removal. The sentence was simple, but the impact wasn't. Karen blinked. That's not your decision. The driver didn't change tone. It is, in this case. A small crowd had started to gather. Not intentionally, just neighbors stepping outside, watching, sensing something unusual. Karen felt it. The shift, the attention, the loss of certainty. On what basis? She pressed. The driver answered clearly now. No hesitation left. This vehicle is tied to the ownership structure of our company. A pause. And we cannot authorize action against internal assets without executive approval. Karen frowned. What does that even mean? And that's when Daniel said it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly. It means you called my company. Silence spread across the street. Not confusion, not noise, just stillness. Because everyone understood what that meant, even if they didn't fully grasp the details. Karen didn't respond immediately, because for the first time, she didn't have a response ready. Daniel didn't continue, didn't explain further, didn't push. He simply stepped back, gave space, because the realization was already doing the work for him. Karen looks at the driver, then back at Daniel, and quietly asks, You own this company? Karen had asked the question, but she already knew the answer. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The driver did it for him. Yes, ma'am.
Short. Direct.
Final. And just like that, the authority Karen had been holding on to slipped. Not all at once, but enough. She tried to recover. That doesn't change the violation. It was the only ground she had left. The rules. Daniel nodded slightly. Then let's talk about the violation. His tone never changed.
Still calm.
Still measured. But now, he was leading the conversation. He stepped toward the truck. ran his hand lightly across the side. This vehicle is registered, maintained, and fully compliant under state classification.
No emotion.
Just facts. Karen tried to interrupt. The HOA has its own. Daniel didn't raise his voice, but he didn't stop either. And HOA authority has limits. That landed harder, because it wasn't opinion. It was knowledge. The driver remained silent now, observing, because this was no longer his situation to manage. Neighbors moved closer, not forming a crowd, but no longer pretending not to watch. Karen felt it. Every eye, every shift in attention. You've been issuing penalties without proper classification review, Daniel continued. Each sentence precise. Escalating enforcement without verification. Another step, another layer, and initiating third-party action under incomplete authority. Silence. Not because people didn't understand, but because they understood enough. Karen's composure began to crack. Not visibly at first, just in the pauses. You're overcomplicating this, she said. Daniel shook his head slightly.
No.
I'm clarifying it. The difference mattered. At that moment, another car pulled up. Not a neighbor. Not random. One of the HOA board members. They stepped out confused, looking between Karen, Daniel, and the stopped repo truck. What's going on? They asked. Karen turned quickly. Relief mixed with urgency. He's refusing enforcement. But before she could continue, the driver spoke.
No, sir.
We're declining the order. That word mattered. Declining. Not delaying. Not questioning. Declining. Why? The board member asked. And again, the answer came clean. Conflict of ownership. Now, there was no hiding it. The situation wasn't just unusual anymore. It was public. Karen looked around. The control she once held over quiet meetings was gone in the open air. Daniel didn't press further, didn't humiliate, didn't escalate emotionally. And that made it worse. Because he didn't need to. The facts were already enough. The board member exhaled slowly. We'll need to review this. A careful sentence. But it meant one thing. This wasn't over. And Karen was no longer in charge of it. As the repo truck prepares to leave, the driver hands Daniel a document and quietly says, "You might want to take a look at what they submitted." The street was quieter the next day. Not physically, but socially. People still walked their dogs, still checked their mail, still followed routines. But something had changed. They looked longer, listened more carefully, because the illusion of control had been broken. Inside the HOA structure, things moved quickly, not publicly, but decisively. Meetings were called, documents reviewed, decisions reconsidered, because what had happened wasn't just a failed enforcement. It was exposure. Karen Whitmore didn't appear outside that morning. For the first time in a long while, her window remained closed.
No observation. No monitoring.
Just stillness. Across the street, Daniel's routine didn't change. Same morning, same coffee, same calm presence. The truck remained exactly where it had always been.
But now,
no one questioned it. A few neighbors nodded as they passed. Not dramatically, not exaggerated, just acknowledgement, respect, without words. Days later, a notice was issued. Not to Daniel, but to the HOA. A formal review, policy adjustments, enforcement limitations. Language that sounded official, but carried one clear message. Things had gone too far. Karen attended the next meeting, but she didn't lead it, didn't control it. She sat quietly, listening, because the authority she once held had been redistributed, not taken by force, but removed through exposure. Daniel never spoke at the meeting, never needed to, because his role in all of this was never about winning. It was about allowing the truth to surface. Weeks passed. The neighborhood settled again. Still clean, still orderly, but different. Less tension, less fear, more balance. And Karen? She remained, but quieter, more careful, because once control is challenged, it never returns the same way. One evening, as the sun lowered across the street, Daniel stood beside his truck. not admiring it, not protecting it, just present. A neighbor walked by, paused briefly. Everything worked out, they said. Daniel nodded. It usually does.
No pride. No arrogance. Just certainty.
Because he never rushed, never reacted. He simply waited until the situation revealed itself. In a place where rules were used to control, he was the only one who understood how to use them correctly.